People who are pushing for a guest worker program show not the slightest interest in what has been happening under guest worker programs in Europe. Facts are apparently irrelevant. So is logic. Guests are people you invite to your home. Gatecrashers are people who come without being invited. Home invaders are people who break in, despite doors that have been shut to keep them out. If the discussion of immigration laws respected either logic or honesty, we would be talking about a program to legalize home invaders instead of a guest worker program. As for facts, guest workers from third world countries have created centers of crime and violence in Europe, and some guest worker communities have become breeding grounds for terrorists. Just as crime and violence in American inner cities have led not only to white flight, but also to a flight of the black, Hispanic, and Asian middle classes, so in Europe, much of the native-born European population has fled from cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Brussels. Joel Kotkin's classic book, The City, noted the influx of immigrants who were recruited to Europe during the labor shortages of the 1950s and 1960s, who have become an increasingly angry and sometimes violent element in what long had been remarkably peaceful urban areas. Another classic book, Our Culture, What's Left of It, by Theodore Dalrymple, found a similar pattern in France. Long before the Muslim riots in Paris, which shocked France and the world, Dalrymple pointed out how immigrants in France had become a major source of crime and violence, not only in Paris but in other parts of the country. The housing projects immediately surrounding Paris have become concentrations of several million third world immigrants, a population filled with the hatred it bears for the other official society of France. They are not appeased by the people who carelessly toss them the crumbs of Western prosperity. What they want is what most people want, respect, and this cannot be given to them, least of all by the French welfare state. In order to feel self-respect, the young especially needed to see themselves as warriors in a civil war, not mere ne'er-do-wells and criminals. This antisocial vision has been supported and even celebrated by many intellectuals, much as both black and white intellectuals have celebrated the senseless brutality and cheap vulgarity of rap music in America. What may be especially relevant to the situation in the United States is that the immigrant parents and grandparents of the violent youths came to France with a very different view. They were glad to be in France, which for most was a big improvement over where they came from. They were better Frenchmen than either their children or grandchildren, Dalrymple noted. They would never have booed the French national anthem at a public event, as the later generations did, and as the American national anthem has been booed in Los Angeles. The later generations were not born in the third world countries from which their parents and grandparents escaped. They were born in France, and resented not having the same prosperity as other Frenchmen. Here again, the media and the intelligentsia in France, as in the United States, tend to turn differences in achievement, gaps, disparities, into social injustices, rather than reflections of differences in the things that create achievement. One of the things that make many people such passionate advocates of amnesty for illegal immigrants from Mexico is that so many Mexican immigrants are hard-working, decent family people. That was also true of many third-world guest workers in Europe, who were glad to be there, but whose children and grandchildren have developed very different and very poisonous attitudes, with the help of activists, demagogues, and the media. Today's illegal immigrants are too often analogized to early 20th century immigrants from Europe, but their situation is far more similar to that of contemporary guest workers in Europe. An ugly reality. Thank heaven for the massive marches across the country by those favoring illegal immigrants. These marches revealed the ugly truth behind the fog of pious words and clever political spin from the media and from both Democrats and Republicans in Washington. Guest workers? Did any of the strident speakers, with their in-your-face bombast in Spanish, sound like guests? Did they sound like people who wanted to become Americans? Were they even asking for amnesty? They didn't sound like they were asking for anything. They sounded like they were telling, demanding, threatening. Somebody must have told them that their Mexican flags that dominated the earlier marches were not making a good impression on television, so they started flying American flags. But such cosmetic changes did not keep the ugly reality from coming through in their hostile speeches. These were not the speeches of people who wanted to join American society, but people who wanted their own turf on American soil, in disregard and defiance of what American citizens want. Europe has already been through this guest worker policy that we are being urged to follow. They have learned the hard way what it means to have a growing foreign population in their midst, a population that insists on remaining foreign and hostile to the culture, values, and people around them. Some European countries have learned this lesson at the cost of riots and bloodshed in the streets and lives lost in terrorist attacks. Others have only had to contend with national polarization, thus far, but polarization is not a small thing. In this country, however, there are still people who refuse to learn any lesson at all. Some business interests see only an opportunity to get cheap labor. Some intellectuals see only abstract principles about abstract people crossing an abstract border. Some tell us loftily that earlier generations of immigrants who were once thought to be unassimilable turned out over time to become as American as anyone else and patriotic citizens. That might well be true of immigrants from Mexico, both legal and illegal, if the circumstances of today were the same as the circumstances during an earlier era of immigration from Europe. But circumstances are not the same, and those circumstances are not going to become the same by pretending that they are. The ugly display of grievance-mongering bombast at the illegal immigrant marches is just one of those circumstances that are not the same as in an earlier era. When people came here from Europe, they came here to become Americans. There was no prouder title for them. American generals of German ancestry led the fight against Germany in both world wars. The Irish Fighting 69th earned its fame on the battlefields of the First World War, and Japanese-American fighting units were among the most highly decorated in World War II. They proved they were Americans. The underlying tragedy of the present situation is that it is doubtful whether the activist loudmouths, who were too contemptuous of this country to even speak its language while demanding its benefits, represent most immigrants from Mexico. Both legal and illegal immigrants have come here primarily to work and make a better life for themselves and their families. But a country requires more than workers. It requires people who are citizens, not only in name, but in commitment. Americanization did not happen automatically in earlier times, and it will not happen automatically today. Immigrants in an earlier era had leaders and organizations actively working to transform them into Americans. The Catholic Church with the Irish, and numerous organizations among the Jews, for example. Today's immigrant activists and the politicians who kowtow to them have just the opposite agenda, to keep foreigners foreign and to make other Americans accept and adjust to that. It will be a national tragedy if they succeed. Just what problem will amnesty solve? Illegal aliens will benefit and politicians will benefit by sweeping the illegality under the rug by making it legal. But how will American citizens benefit? America can lose big time.